13 regiments of infantry. Some of those were 9-month regiments.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them were 3-year regiments. So there's variations there, about half and half. The 1 regiment of cavalry and a couple of artillery batteries,
Mm-hmm.
and a company of sharpshooters, and that all adds up. Not at any one time were the 30,000 there. In other words, there were replacements coming
Yep.
and going. But and when all is said and done, if you took the population, Vermont was second in the nation in terms of people able to go to war and the number who actually went. So their contribution was better than 32 other states in the Union.
So I read about how Vermont had a lot of people go in the Civil War, but how they also, the men they sent were of good quality men and fought in a lot of good battles. Were there?
Yeah. One of the famous quotes, which is the title of a book a guy wrote, was called "Put the Vermonters in Front." Something like that. Put the Vermonters ahead, I think it was. So they were marching down Virginia, and he was afraid they were going to run into some opposition. He didn't want the first guys in the front of the line to get shot at and take off. So he said, close the ranks and put the Vermonters ahead. He wanted them to be the first ones there. The so-called Vermont Brigade, which was the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th Infantry Regiments, which served through the whole war, was considered to be the best brigade in the entire Union Army for the entire war. Almost, not everybody, but almost exclusively people from Vermont. Part of the thinking was, if you go into a regiment, which is several regiments make up a brigade, in other words, in this case it's 5 regiments. If you go into a regiment with people from your own state, from perhaps your own town, you're less likely to not do things you should because you don't want to be embarrassed. You don't want people back home to know you took off. And they found that that was part of the saving grace of Vermont regiments. They were solid. They were just, the heritage goes back to Ethan Allen, the Green Mountain Boys, and all that. So there's quite a military tradition there. And yes, the same is true with the cavalry. The cavalry is considered one of the top 5 cavalry units in the war also. The sharpshooters became quite famous because that was something new. They never had sharpshooters before. And there actually became several companies of those. So, man for man, I guess you could say, sure, Vermont troops were among the best.
So, in the 1st Vermont Cavalry, they rode the Vermont-bred Morgan horses, and so were those horses considered better than the other horses?
From what I've read, I'm not a horse person, but the horse was a little, military had certain standards for horses. They had to be, the term they use is hands high. I don't know about horses, but that's how you measure them. It's an old-fashioned way of measuring. And Morgan horses were just a tad smaller than the Army standard, but because they had stamina, I guess was one thing they had. They were a very strong horse, and I guess a relatively, comparatively speed horse. They were excellent for cavalry troops. And so several regiments, not just the ones from Vermont, had them. The 5th New York, for example, had them. 1st Maine had them. 1st Massachusetts had them. They rode them because they were considered an exemplary cavalry horse.
So the reason I'm interested in Vermont in the Civil War is because that at my house we have discharge papers and a sword from one of my family members that fought in the Civil War, and so I was wondering what got you interested in the Civil War? Same thing.
I don't have the actual documentation that you have, but there were 24 letters that belonged to 4 brothers who were in the war, and one of my other distant relatives put them into a book. It really wasn't much of a book, but it got me inspired because I knew I had family members in the war, so that caused me to pursue it and then find out more about it. Plus, I've always liked cavalry, and I've always been a fan of Custer, and that all came together. They were in Custer's brigade.
Mm.
Do you know what regiment your fellow was in? Cavalry, infantry?
I can't remember at the moment, but it all says it on his discharge paper.
Take a look at it. I'd be interested to know.
He was from Tunbridge.
Okay.
So
you mentioned battles. I didn't say anything about that.
Oh yeah.
As far as the cavalry goes, their most famous battle was the Gettysburg. And the unique piece about that was the battle, the portion of the battle they fought in was fought after the whole battle was over with. Pickett's Charge is the most famous aspect of Gettysburg, and that was a culminating event on July 3rd, 1 to 3 o'clock. The Vermont Cavalry fought at 5 o'clock. Their commander basically was a little upset that he hadn't had a chance to win any glory. He wasn't a Vermonter. His name was Kilpatrick. He was the brigade commander. And so he had sort of discretionary orders and decided to order a charge. And maybe if the Confederates were disorganized and demoralized after Pickett's charge, they could like punch a hole and sort of get them all running and retreating. And it didn't work that way. They got all shot up. But even though it was a suicide mission, I don't know if you're familiar with the Charge of the Light Brigade in the Crimean War. There's a famous poem written about it, and they charged into the Valley of Death, 600 men, even though they knew they were going to get slaughtered, they were ordered to do it. Well, this was very similar to that. So they gained a lot of credibility in the Army because they went through with the mission, even though it was basically a suicide mission. Cedar Creek is probably the most significant battle that the Vermont Cavalry was in. That was a crowning achievement of the war. It was in late 1864, and Confederates, you might say, won the first half of the battle, and then they lost the second half, and ultimately the whole battle. And in the final analysis, the Vermont Cavalry and the 5th New York basically turned the tide and captured hundreds of prisoners and all kinds of cannon and everything else. It was a tremendous victory. Up in the state capitol was a big painting of the Battle of Cedar Creek in the Capitol building that was painted by a guy who was a soldier in that battle named Scott. So that's probably their most famous. As far as the Vermont Brigade's concerned, they were in all the major battles of the Civil War. The only one they weren't in, oddly enough, was Gettysburg. And the reason for that was when the Union troops converged on Gettysburg, they marched in from different directions. As they arrived, they were placed in the line. It just so happened the Vermont infantry was farthest away, you might say. It took them longer to get there. So they held them in reserve, and they never actually got to fight in the battle at all. But they were in all the other big battles of the war.
So, for the Vermont soldiers, did they have something like a draft that people went in, or did most of them just sign up?
When it all started in 1861, everybody and his brother, you might say, was running down to sign up, because in those days, a way to get away from home, how do you get away from home, well, you join the Army, and it was considered glorious and glamorous, and a worthy thing to be was a soldier. Up until the Civil War, your chances of surviving were pretty good. I mean, it wasn't quite as random as it is today, where somebody fires a rocket 2 miles away and blows somebody up and doesn't even know it's coming. Civil War was kind of a watershed where the old stuff started to go away and the new stuff started coming in, which made it more deadly. So when they first went off to war in the Civil War, it was a lark. It was going to be a short war. It was going to be fun. If you didn't get in that early, you might never get in there because it was going to be over. So they had no trouble with enlistments. And, people enlisted quite readily. They had 300,000 men very quickly when Lincoln called for them. And as a result, the initial enlistments were voluntary. Then all of a sudden they realized the war was going to last a little longer than everybody thought. And I think each year from 61, 2, 3, 4, Lincoln issued a call for 300,000 men. So by the time they got done, there were over 2 million that served in the Civil War. So when you or after that first bunch of patriots run down to sign up, and then they find out, whoops, this isn't going to be so much fun after all, it wasn't so easy to get people. So they started offering higher bounties. In other words, the bounty initially was $100, then it went to $300. You could hire a substitute to go if you had the money. And the reason you would hire a substitute was, yes, they did institute a draft. There were riots in New York City over the draft. People didn't, in a democracy, you don't draft people, you volunteer to do things. So it wasn't very popular. Vermont, I don't think, and I'm not up on this, but I'm pretty sure in Vermont the draft never really mattered because they still had plenty of volunteers. Again, the state put out the second most troops percentage-wise of anybody, so there never was a problem. And you read the newspaper articles and they'll say things like, Vermonters, step forth and defend your country. Don't wait to be drafted. Don't let the shame of a draft ever, involve Vermont. Let's all volunteer. And they never seemed to have a problem in the state of getting people to go, so it wasn't an issue here. But yeah, they did draft toward the middle and end of the war. And they also, of course, they started using black troops too.
Yep.
Which again, made the numbers go up and you didn't have to draft.
Okay, so that's pretty much all the information I need.